right, so what I'd like to do, if you're willing, is to take the next 10 or 15 minutes for you to kick around your thoughts on a couple of questions I'll put out. And then when that's done, I'll open it to questions from the floor. So the questions I'd like to pose to the three of you is, what do you see in over the last decade or two as some of the most promising trends in experimental economics, or least promising trends if you'd rather talk about that? And also, what do you think's been overlooked? You don't want to tell, of course, I think very properly tell people what to do, but it is good to sort of maybe point out some things that might be overlooked. So if each of you is willing to take that on, anybody want to start with any of those? What's promising or unpromising trends, and what maybe is overlooked could be done a little more. John, you willing to start?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm just amazed at the variety of things that people are looking at and the intellect that they bring to these things. I mean, to see, really well-trained economists coming and doing experiments. Some of my favorite things are auctions. I think for many of us, it's a favorite thing. I think the idea of behavioral economics wouldn't have gotten started without experiments showing that people don't always follow fully rational behavior. And so I think that's been a real synergy, and I'll just leave it at that. I'm sure my colleagues have better things to say.
You looking at me? Don't know. Let me think about that a minute. I guess what I see that's really kind of exciting is that's really not a very good question, because you realize how I'm going to answer that. What I see as most exciting is got to be the thing I'm working on, right? So I have to be very careful.
Trends in the community.
Yeah. Well, some of the things I see most exciting is the move to something I just said that I didn't like. That is the move to field kind of studies. I don't really. It's not the case I dislike them. It's that they're hard, and sometimes the anxiousness to explain something in the quote real world is overwhelms the kind of indirect method you need to go to find out about it, because we get a little impatient. That's the problem. The thing I find really quite exciting is with the development of both the abstractness of the theory and the use of econometric methods, ability to go in and look at structural equations and the cleverness of field experiments to go back in and uncover what is a deeper relationship there. I think that's quite exciting, and we're seeing more and more and more of that, and I'm sure we could. That also goes along with something I say, that the robustness of our models and experiments in terms of being able to handle large things of very large scale and very large complex scope, evolving right out of basic experimental economics. We're seeing more and more and more really large projects, like the recent auction in Los Angeles is directly related to experiments that Charlie Hull did. So we're seeing more and more of this kind of merger, where the only reason that we have to trust a theory or a model came from really, really, really simple and even simpler experiments. But yet when we take that lesson and go to one of these extremely complex cases, the things we discover is, that model was pretty good. Wasn't right, but wasn't bad. And we can supply that where no other profession in any other school of thought or science can do it. So that's uniquely experimental economics. It's a unique contribution, and you can see it just moving along very fast. So I think that those are two. The third thing is the role of information and information structures, and how the information is beginning to shape both at the individual level and at the market level. So those are the three kind of areas that turn me on. Of course, the trouble is I have very, very, very low standards. I get excited about everything. So.
Well, I guess one of the things I would suggest that's really quite exciting is my first brush with it was in the work I did with Steve Rossetti, our paper. It's the 30th anniversary, actually, of that paper on combinatorial auctions. But it was also, in general, had to do with the whole notion of a smart computer-assisted market. We had discovered after, under the leadership of Arlington Williams at Arizona, we had gone electronic beginning in 1976. One of the things we kind of discovered that we hadn't anticipated, although it's kind of obvious after it happened, was that we could now do experiments and handle much larger message spaces than we were able to do in our hand-run experiments before. And that really changed the way we kind of thought about markets. And it was out of that work that we got at Arizona got involved in electric power liberalization and also natural gas pipelines, because that Federal Energy Regulatory Commission was able to move, was starting to move in the 80s to liberalize the gas market, and that impacted pipeline competition. And so although we started in electric power, for a while we worked on that. And that led to, it's not a field experiment, it's actually a field application. I mean, you actually go out there and find that you can change the world because people are hungry for a technology that allows them to try it before they fly it. So we kind of got swept up in the worldwide movement to deregulate industries that had previously always been conceived of as natural monopolies. And if they had been, they certainly weren't anymore. But anyway, that trend is very, and like the auction section this morning, it's clear that that's alive and well, and it's very natural for people who have problems, allocation problems in the field, and they're open to new ways. It's very natural for them to be attracted to to experimental, because it gives them a chance to try out ideas, try out mechanism, and make their mistakes where it's pretty cheap when you make them. And where we've not done that in electric power, as in the disaster that occurred in California, you can see how costly it can be to do things that the Australians would never have done, because they moved into it in a pretty systematic way. I do want to say one thing outside of Dan's question. I come back to what Reinhardt said about the double auction. I think that was kind of deceptively successful, in the sense that I have a much different perspective on it now than I had even 10 years ago, because that environment was one in which, when a buyer and seller interacted, they traded, they realized the surplus from their trade immediately, and even more important, before they went to market, they already knew whether they were a buyer or a seller, and also they were trading something that they couldn't retrade. Now, that turns out to be an extremely important market classification. That's all non-durable consumer goods. And if you take government expenditures out of the gross domestic product and call that private product, 70% of it is non-durable goods. And those markets are incredibly efficient. They're never a source really of instability in the economy. The problems we have in the economy come from the other 25%, okay? Especially when you produce goods that can last 50 to 100 years, it's called a house, and you finance it with credit. You see, that's where the trouble is. That's where the instability is, and we've just gone through our, and the second time in 80 years, a major balance sheet crunch, and we still haven't, of course, recovered from it. So that what I eventually came to realize was how special that case was, and that all of the action in terms of understanding instability comes from experiments that were not represented in those original ones. Okay.
I'd like to throw it open to questions from the floor, directed at the entire panel or any particular member. Rachel?
So economics has often been accused of being imperialistic. That economics is sort of exported economics to political science and sociology and all these different fields. And I'm starting to see experimental economics as being a little imperialistic too. That there's lots of different fields where people are starting to run experiments, both within economics, development, for example, labor, but also across different areas, think about finance or operations management or other places. Is that a trend that you all have seen or think actually exists or is going to continue?
Who's feeling imperialistic?
Well, I guess, I mean, the fact that economics has, branched out in terms of formal political economy and in terms of business applications and things like that, it seems to me is very natural for experiments to follow. All right, I mean, it's just we're doing a lot of experiments within standard areas of economics, and I think it's just totally natural that you'll follow that once the theory or the insights or the general principles are applied to these other areas, that it's natural for experiments to follow.
Yeah, I've been guilty of that particular enterprise being imperialistic. In fact, the first experiments that I really did in economics were not in economics at all; they were in political science. In fact, many of the procedures we use today came out of those early experiments, both in terms of how the institutions work and the way we structure multidimensional problems. Actually don't come out of economics at all. They come out of political science. So now I would say that had a short-lived success in political science. I think the success came from the ability to bring at least a structure, a body of principles, and a body of testing to an area where people thought it was really very hard. And it had been very hard. There's no ability to make a little progress. You need to be able to step away from an experiment that says, well, my idea was really crap. It's really, you've got to be able to step back and say that, whereas and you can do that in economics, whereas in many other places you really can't say that very cleanly. And I think that that's probably what we're seeing here. But with respect to imperialism, I see the imperialism going both ways. I mean, I see more psychology in the papers and discussions here today than I've seen in this group in ever. And so I would say that, I don't know which way it's going, but it's fluid, and that's exciting.
Well, I think experimental economics is inherently interdisciplinary. And it has become so. It didn't begin that way. It began very narrowly within economics, but it quickly, I think, by necessity became interdisciplinary. And that's involves imports as well as exports, okay? So I'm not sure whether the imperialist charge entirely applies. I think it would be, I think it is important in modeling the small groups, though, that we really re-examine the way we think about those. And that's the reason why in my original remarks I said so much about Adam Smith's first book. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily the way to model it, but it's certainly a way of thinking about it in non-utilitarian terms that gets at what I think is the essence of sociality. And that essence is that you don't combine the word social and preference because social preferences aren't preferences. I mean, social has to do with relationships and building relationships, and those rules of the small group are much different than the rules of the market. And you can't productively apply the rules of the small group to the market, and you can't go the other way. It doesn't work. And of course, the demand for sociality was never greater. It's now global, and it's in Facebook. And all these media companies, there's never been a greater need for people to relate to each other in kind of ongoing what David Hume calls social commerce, okay?
So, as a graduate student in economics, also receiving some of that education at Harvard that you were talking about, I'm kind of conflicted with this very deep question, and if it's a stupid one, I would be really happy if you could explain it to me. Kind of conflicted between those two streams that I see in economics that I see quite different and separate. What are we really trying to get at? On the one hand, you talked about the Bolton-Ockensfeld model of social preferences, and this is coming up with a very nice model that's really appealing. It's really exciting, right? Because with a very simple formulation, you can summarize and predict behavior. But it's unclear to me how much you really understand what is really going on as an economic phenomena underneath. And this is the second stream, trying to really understand and unpack the processes that lead to behavior. So how do you see those two streams playing out in the future in the economics profession? On the one hand, trying to come up with models that summarize and predict the data without actually caring so much about understanding what's underneath, and on the second hand, using experiment to really understand how those parameters play out with one another, what are the deep relationships and the complexities. I don't know if that's clear.
Well, when I referenced the Bolton-Ockensfelds and Fair-Schmidt models, I mean, at the time they summarized a lot of data without needing to ignore too many dead rats, so to speak, okay? You know, it's always easy to have a good theory that ignores a lot of dead rats. But they didn't need to do that. And what I thought, what I was trying to say, is that I thought it was I mean, it led to people doing experiments that really, I think, led us to understand things a lot better, or another way to put it is to narrow down what we don't know, okay? So that was the real utility that I found from those models, and I think that's when we have an encompassing case for encompassing models and summarizing a lot of literature that had previously, or I should say a lot of experimental data that previously didn't fit together, you're going to develop a model, but it's bound to be destroyed, okay? Because people are going to do experiments, and they're going to find there's problems here, problems there, but that's understanding the underlying process, okay?
I don't know. I guess that thinking about that, I guess I kind of agree with John, but the to me, just to try to think about the question you're asking, as you do these experiments, you learn two things. One is you get this intuition about what's happening. That's understanding. I can't write that down in a mathematical form. The other thing I learn is what I can write down in an axiomatic form, so you can take that axiom, take it to a different spot, in a much more complex spot, use it as an intuition or a guide for an experiment, and you know what? You're going to see roughly the same thing I saw. So this uneasiness that I can't understand things at this level of intuition is very natural. And I think as we move more and more towards the individual, you know, as a lot of this stuff, early stuff, never discussed the individual. Never discussed the individual. Too hard, at least for me. But you could axiomatize and structure a market or a committee and actually get out a system of models that really helps you understand it, helps you see it, not help you understand it. You had to live through it to understand it. But I think at the level of the individual, we're still not at that point. We're moving in that direction very rapidly. But to understand things in a very deep way, in a thoughtful way you're talking about, I don't think that any of our mathematical structures is there.
Well, I think it's not, you said that it wasn't helping you understand what was going on, and I think it can't help you understand it because those kind of models are not really addressing the primary elements that are involved in human sociality. Just think about the mental experiment that Adam Smith gives us, and you know and you see, even if you get utility representations, and I would say that almost certainly you can design an experiment that will falsify it. One of the things that impressed me about inequity aversion, it was born falsified. We had already done trust games where player one passed to player two, and then no matter what player two did, player one was going to be worse off than two. But you know, Adam Smith wouldn't have any trouble understanding why players two didn't defect, and he wouldn't have any trouble understanding why player one might pass to player two. And it really didn't have that much to do with the fact it was a one-shot game, although that, with repetition, of course, there's every reason to believe that the relationship might have a chance to be strengthened. But people don't go around in the world and think, oh, I can cut a corner here, it's just one play. Yeah, okay, but if you found out, wow, the moment arm on that probability is pretty large. And all of this is central to the way Adam Smith understood small groups. It was the word reputation, by the way, appears very often in that work.
Don't be shy.
I have a question. Gentlemen, thank you for, this has been enlightening. I'm curious on your thoughts that 50 years from now, we could likely be sitting in this room, well, most of us won't be here, but there'll be another panel of the youngsters in this room that are going to look back on the last 50 years between this conference and then. What would you like them to be talking about as the biggest breakthrough in that period?
Are you asking me what I'm working on now?
That's I have to agree with Charlie on that. That'd be my answer. I mean,
What Charlie's working on now?
what I'm working on is quite different from what Charlie's working on. But I mean, from what I'm working on, all I can tell you is what I'm working on. You know, my big thing these days is to have these play many of these games with 2-player teams, get into their dialogues, which is a shortcut to getting into their heads, and understanding the process under which they're making these choices, and then comparing some of that with individual play. And I think many of the processes are similar, and you know, there's differences. But at any rate, it's sort of a poor man's fMRI. Okay, you know, just let them talk to each other and have to agree on decisions, and use the dialogue to understand what the hell they're thinking about.
Well, 50 years ago, I couldn't have imagined that people have been talking about what I was doing then. And so I can't possibly imagine what people will be talking about 50 years from now, or what they should be talking about. I do think that the one thing that will not change, and that is that it's important to try things out before you believe them.
Yeah.
That's because that's what we've been doing, and I think that has changed economics. It's certainly changed the way we think about economics, and you know, I think we're doing pretty well to have had 4 experimentalists recognized by Stockholm, and I think it's because we're doing something right. It's not because the rest of economics is doing so badly.
Maybe one last question.
This is, I'm afraid this is going to end up coming out just a comment rather than a question, but I had a reaction to something John said that I think is worth us thinking about. Your preference is that we don't have special sessions called field experiments, that they be, you know, mixed in by topic. Well, if you take that reasoning to an extreme, then maybe we shouldn't have experimental economics conferences, because they should all be, you know, sessions by topic. But what I personally find useful about field experiment sessions is that we kind of tend to think about the same sorts of tools in different settings, and so it's really useful to see what kinds of designs are people doing in other areas. So that's, if you have reactions, I'm interested.